In a forested valley in Romania, there is a hill that should not exist. From a distance, it looks like any other rise in the landscape. Dig into it, and the ground is wrong. The hill is barely made of soil at all. It is built from ash, charcoal, and earth burned hard and red. Layer, stacked on layer, meters deep. Somebody lit fires on this exact spot, over and over, for centuries. People kept walking back to this one patch of ground, generation after generation, to burn things. A few steps away is the reason. A small spring runs here year-round, and the water comes up clear and cold and completely undrinkable. It is close to 5 times saltier than the ocean. One swallow and your mouth burns. So, a spring nobody can drink from, next to the largest pile of ancient fire waste in the region. Those two facts sit side by side, and together they point at one answer. The people who came here were making salt. The trick fits in a single sentence. Take water that is too salty to drink, put it over a fire, and let the water leave until the salt has nowhere to go. Saying it takes 5 seconds. Doing it with a clay pot, a wood fire, and your bare hands, with no thermometer, no metal, and no writing, is a different job entirely. And the ash in that hill says people had already mastered that job more than 8,000 years ago. This is how they did it. The place is called Poiana Slatinei, near the village of Lunca, in the hills of northeastern Romania. When archaeologists began working there, they treated the hill the way detectives treat a room. Everything in it is evidence. So take the evidence one piece at a time. The first piece is the age. Charcoal survives burial better than almost anything, and charcoal can be dated. Samples from the deepest layers of the mound came back at around 6,000 years before Christ. Put that number next to things you know. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the pyramids by more than 2,000 years. It is older than the wheel, as far as any surviving evidence can show, and older than the first written word by a comfortable margin. The fires at the bottom of that hill are the oldest evidence of salt making that anyone has found anywhere on Earth. The second piece is the water itself. The spring at Lunca carries about 160 grams of salt in every liter. Ocean water carries about 35. So scoop up 1 pot of water from this spring, and you are holding the salt of nearly 5 pots of seawater. Nature had already done the hardest part of the work underground, forcing water through deep beds of buried salt and sending it back up to the surface loaded almost to its limit. A spring like this is a shortcut. And the people of the early Neolithic clearly understood exactly what kind of shortcut it was. The fresh streams in the next valley were fine for drinking, and they left no hills of ash behind. The salt spring did. They kept returning here, to the water nobody could drink. The third piece is the repetition. One fire leaves a smudge. The mound at Lunca holds the remains of hundreds of fireplaces, pressed into distinct layers. One round of work stacked on the next. And those layers kept building for something like 5 centuries. Read them from the bottom up, and you are reading a work schedule that outlasted every person who ever followed it. This was a place people returned to on purpose, with a plan. Over more lifetimes than anyone standing at those fires could count. A single lucky experiment does not leave a hill behind. An industry does. One honest note belongs here, because the researchers who published this site are careful about it themselves. The ash proves enormous. Repeated burning beside a salt spring. It does not preserve a snapshot of the exact technique those first crews used. So, the fine details of the earliest method have to be rebuilt from later sites, and from modern attempts to do the same work with the same tools. The evidence gives us the stage, the fuel bill, and the date. The performance has to be reconstructed. So reconstruct it. Boiling water sounds like the easiest thing in the world. Right up until you count the water that has to disappear and the wood that has to burn to make that happen. Here is what a batch of Stone Age salt actually took. From the first pot of brine to the last dry crystal. Start with the bill, because the bill comes first and it is steep. The fuel is wood, and the wood pays for everything. Even with brine as rich as Lunka's, getting 1 kilogram of salt means persuading roughly 6 liters of water to leave as vapor. And every liter costs fuel. Try the same job with ordinary seawater and the price balloons to nearly 30 liters of water for that same kilogram. That is the gift of a strong spring. It cuts the fuel bill by 4/5 before anyone strikes a spark. The bill that remains is still brutal. Trees have to come down. Logs have to be split and hauled and stacked and dried. And all of that labor is spent up front, before a single grain of salt exists. A salt operation eats forest. The hill of ash at Lunka is the receipt. Now the batch itself. A clay pot sits over the fire, filled from the spring. Look inside and there is nothing to see. The brine is murky, a little gray, frankly unpromising. Nothing about it suggests that anything of value is in there. If you did not already know the secret of this water, you would pour it out. Keep the fire steady and the pot starts working. And what it does is closer to sorting than cooking. Heat gives water a way out of the pot. Vapor rises off the surface, hour after hour. And vapor is a door with a strict rule. Only water gets through. The salt dissolved in that water holds no ticket. So, the water leaves. Molecule by molecule. And everything it was carrying stays behind. The level in the pot drops. What remains grows heavier and denser by the hour. Until the liquid moves differently. Sluggish and thick. Carrying more salt than water can comfortably hold. Then comes the moment the whole day has been pointed at. Along the rim of the pot, where the liquid is shallowest and the water escapes fastest, a thin white crust appears. The first crystals. After hours of feeding wood into a fire under a pot of gray water, this is the first time the water gives you visible proof that it was hiding something all along. The white line thickens. Crystals begin forming out in the open liquid. Small flakes that catch the firelight. Sinking and gathering. The pot is filling with solid matter that nobody put there. This is also the hour when the whole day can die in a single second. Clay is a moody material over open flame, and a crew pushing to finish before dark can feed the fire a little too hard. Somewhere in the flames, the overheated pot answers with a sound like a knuckle cracking. A seam opens. A full day of brine, hours of it, pours straight down into the coals in one long hiss. And a column of steam climbs into the evening air, carrying the entire day with it. The water, gone. The salt, scattered through the ashes. The wood, already burned. Every crew that ever worked this spring knew that sound. And there was only one answer to it. Haul more water. Split more wood. Start again. So the fire had to be held in a narrow band. Hot enough to keep the water leaving. Gentle enough to keep the pot alive. And the crews at Lunka held it there, using nothing but their senses. The sound of the simmer changes as brine thickens, from a loose bubbling to something heavier and slower. The crust at the rim changes color as it dries. The steam itself thins out. Stop too early and you have salty mud. Half water, worthless for storage. Stop too late and the drying salt cakes hard against the clay. Every one of those signals had to be learned by ruining batches, and remembered, and taught, because there was nowhere to write anything down. The instrument panel for this machine was a human being. Ride the batch through that window, and the day ends with the fire dying under a pot that holds a wet, gray slush of crystals. Be honest about what that is. It is damp. It is coarse. And it carries flecks of clay and ash from the working day. It is a long way from the clean white salt on a modern table. It is also genuine salt, pulled out of water by fire and patience, using tools that amount to mud and wood. But a pot of wet slush is a prize you still cannot use. It is heavy, it is fragile, and it is stuck at the spring. The salt has been separated from the water, and now it has to be separated from the pot, dried hard, and turned into something a person can carry over a mountain. At salt springs across ancient Europe, archaeologists have found the solution to that last step. And it is strange enough that it became the single biggest clue they now use to track this entire industry. They built pots that were designed to be destroyed. Whether the very first crews at Lunca already used this system, the ash cannot say. What the ground can show, at salt springs worked in the centuries after those earliest fires, from Romania clear across to the Atlantic, is the next step in the technology. And it shows that step in overwhelming quantity. Broken pottery. Mountains of it. At some production sites, the shattered pieces run into the tons, heaped and scattered until the fragments themselves form mounds you can stand on. And the fragments are strange in a very specific way. They come from the same few shapes. Small cups, shallow pans, stubby clay pedestals meant to hold something above a flame. They are all roughly the same size, as if poured from a mold of habit, and they are all broken in the same manner, cracked apart rather than worn out. Pick up one of these pieces and compare it to the other pottery those same communities were making. And the contrast is loud. Neolithic households took pride in their vessels. Cooking pots and serving bowls were smoothed, burnished, decorated with patterns pressed into the wet clay, built to last years of daily use. The salt site pottery has none of that. It is coarse, quickly pinched into shape, poorly fired, and completely plain. Whoever made these was not being careless. They were being efficient. These vessels came from the hands of people who knew, at the moment of making them, that the pot did not need to survive. Because the pot was never the container, the pot was the packaging. Here is how the last step of the operation worked. The wet gray slush from the boiling stage went into these small, crude cups, and the cups went back over the heat, lined up on those clay pedestals above the coals, inside each cup. The remaining moisture cooked away, and the crystals fused, tighter and harder, until the salt set into a single solid block, shaped exactly like the inside of the vessel. At that point, the salt cake and the cup were locked together. And there was only one way to get the product out. You break the pot, crack the cup open like an eggshell, brush away the clay, and what sits in your hand is the finished good. A dry, hard, standardized block of white salt. The vessel was a single-use mold, spent at the moment of harvest. This is a production line with a strange final instruction, where the last step is deliberate destruction, and every finished cake left a small pile of clay shards on the ground as its birth certificate. Archaeologists have a name for this whole class of throwaway salt pottery. They call it briquetage. And once you know what it looks like, it turns up across an astonishing sweep of the ancient world. Sites in England, in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Romania. Different centuries, different cultures. Many of them with no contact at all, and the same disposable clay solution appearing over and over. Faced with the same problem, people kept inventing the same answer. And the problem itself is worth stating plainly, because it answers a question that has been hanging over this whole story. Why make salt at all when the spring holds it for free? Because a spring is a fixed address. The brine is heavy. It is mostly water, and it cannot leave the valley. A salt cake is the opposite of all that. It is dry. It is hard. It is light for what it holds. And one cake looks like the next, which means cakes can be counted, split, stacked in a basket, and carried across a mountain range to people who have no salty spring of their own. Boiling the water out of brine is really an act of packing. It shrinks a resource down to the part worth hauling. So follow the two halves of each batch forward through time. And something almost comical happens to them. The salt, the entire point of the enterprise, vanished. Every cake was traded, crumbled, cooked, and eaten. And whatever escaped that fate met rain and dissolved back into the earth. Of the actual product, after thousands of years, nothing remains. Not 1 gram. The packaging is immortal. Fired clay is one of the most durable things humans have ever made. And every shattered cup lying in those mounds is still lying there now. A receipt for one salt cake. Produced, extracted, and carried away by somebody with no name. Which flips the entire investigation on its head. Nobody has ever dug up the salt these fires made. So how can anyone claim to know this industry existed at all? By reading the receipts, the salt itself is the most cooperative vanishing act in the archaeological record. A material that erases its own tracks with the first hard rain. So the people who study this industry work the way investigators work when the body is missing. They stop looking for the thing and start looking for the shadow it cast. By now, you can recognize every part of that shadow. A natural spring, tested and confirmed to be far too salty for drinking. Pits dug nearby, lined to hold liquid. Sitting where storing fresh water would make no sense. Hearths burned and reburned in the same spots until the earth beneath them turned to brick. Ash in quantities no kitchen could produce. And bricktage. The crude, single-use pottery that has no other job in the ancient toolkit. Any one of those clues alone proves very little. A pit is a pit. A fire is a fire. When the whole set turns up together, on one patch of ground, arranged around water nobody could drink. The innocent explanations run out. Only one activity leaves that exact fingerprint. And the fingerprint repeats. 2,000 miles from the Romanian spring, at a site called Street House in northeastern England. Excavators uncovered a shallow pit built to store brine. At least 3 hearths worked hard and repeatedly. And the telltale, coarse ceramics. The whole kit sitting together on a hilltop near the sea. The dates land around 3800 BC. Different landscape. Different people. Different source of salty water. And the same industrial signature pressed into the ground. That repetition is what turns a clever guess into solid history. One site with ash and odd pottery could be argued about forever. The same technical signature at site after site, across the width of a continent, is a technology. Now for the part where honesty earns its keep. Because the strength of this story depends on saying exactly what the evidence can and cannot carry. Some things are known outright. The spring at Lunca is ferociously salty. The burning beside it was massive and repeated across 5 centuries, and the dates sit earlier than any other salt-making evidence found anywhere. Some things are reconstruction, done with confidence. Fire-driven evaporation is the leading explanation for what happened there, because the mountain of ash puts fire at the center of the operation, and because modern crews using replica pots and the same kind of brine have run the process start to finish, and it works. Some things are known clearly, but from later sites, like the briquetage system of molds and cakes, which enters the record generations after those first fires. And one thing stays out of reach. Nobody can name the first person who watched water shrink away in a pot and understood what was happening. And nobody can date the afternoon it happened. Any telling that claims otherwise has left the evidence behind. What the record holds instead is better than a name. The first salt makers left no graves we can point to, no monuments, and no words. Because there were no words to leave, their entire testimony is a hill of ash and a carpet of broken cups. And that testimony has now outlasted empires that carved their kings into stone. The hill in Romania is still there. Trees grow on it now, and the spring beside it still runs salty. The same water that pulled people into that valley more than 8,000 years ago. Nobody built it as a monument. It is just the ash of 5 centuries of work, piled up beside water no one could drink. But it holds the answer to the question this whole story started with. How did ancient humans first make salt? They found water that was already carrying it. And they used fire to force a choice. The water could leave. The salt could not. 8,000 years later, most of the salt on your table is still made by that same decision. Solar ponds do it with sunlight. Factories do it with steam. The tools changed, and the trick never did. Remove the water. Keep what it leaves behind.